Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a long, deliberate look through the lens of a photographer whose work, really, it stands as the definitive visual archive of American struggle, of resilience. We're talking about the mid-20th century. We are diving deep into the life, the work, and the profound, enduring legacy of Dorothea Lange.
It's funny, when you set out to define the American Great Depression, I mean, the actual scale of the human suffering, the displacement, that quiet dignity people had, you inevitably turn to her images. Lange was an American documentary photographer, a photojournalist, and she's best known for that indelible work she produced for the Farm Security Administration, the FSA.
The FSA.
Right. And that work fundamentally altered how we view history and the role of photography within it.
And our mission today is a bit complex. We are, of course, going to analyze the global icon, Migrant Mother. We have to. But we're using that image as more of a pivot point, not the final destination.
Right.
We want to understand the transformation. I mean, what tectonic personal shifts moved her from successfully photographing San Francisco's social elite to becoming a federally employed social conscience with a camera?
And crucially, we have to unpack the two starkly different government assignments she took on. One that generated aid and another that generated censorship.
Exactly.
We're charting the course of a career that's really defined by this ethical urgency and by strategic partnerships. Her work didn't just document poverty, it forced intervention. It's a remarkable study in historical accountability. It shows that personal challenges, they don't just inform your work, they actively sharpen your purpose.
Okay, so let's start with the crucible of her youth, because it's impossible to understand her work without it. It fundamentally shaped how she saw the world, and eventually how she framed it. She was born Dorothea Margaretta Nutzhorn in Hoboken, New Jersey, back in 1895. And her early life carried the weight of two really deep traumas.
The first one was this familial rupture. Her father, Heinrich Nutzhorn, he just left the family. Dorothea was only 12.
That's 12.
Yeah. And that experience of abandonment, it caused her to later drop his name completely. She adopted her mother's maiden name, Lange. And that pain, as awful as it was, it seems to have instilled this necessary layer of independence in her and maybe a lifelong empathy for anyone who felt suddenly cast out or just left behind.
But the second factor was physical, a life-altering illness that she herself said had this immense formative power over her artistic eye. At age 7, she contracted polio.
Polio was just a devastating disease then. And for Lange, it left her with a permanent functional limitation, a weakened right leg and a visible lifelong limp. And while a lot of people might try to hide a difference like that, Lange, she internalized it. She actually turned it into a kind of strategic advantage.
How so?
It forced her to slow down, to observe from a distance, to practice a kind of patience that most people don't have.
There's a quote she gave about this experience that we absolutely have to linger on for a second. It's really the theoretical foundation for her entire method. She said of her altered gait, "It formed me, guided me, instructed me, helped me, and humiliated me. I've never gotten over it, and I'm aware of the force and power of it."
I mean, just think about that phrasing. It's not a limitation, it's an instructor. The humiliation, that self-consciousness of moving differently, it forces you into a position of perpetual observation. You just can't rush in. You have to wait.
You become a student of human interaction from the periphery.
Exactly. In documentary photography, patience and non-intrusion are, they're the paramount virtues. Her body taught her those virtues long before any camera ever did.
And that idea, observation without intrusion, that was honed even further by her surroundings after her father left. The family moved. They went from the suburbs of New Jersey into a profoundly different environment in New York City.
Yes, she was transplanted to Manhattan's Lower East Side, specifically around PS 62 on Hester Street, which was this densely packed, bustling immigrant neighborhood. The sources really emphasize the cultural contrast. She was, according to some accounts, one of the only Gentiles in a very concentrated Jewish community. So she was already physically different because of the polio. Now she was culturally different, too.
So you have this girl with a limp, an obvious outsider, surrounded by people speaking different languages, practicing different customs. And her mother was working, so young Dorothea spent a lot of time on her own, just wandering these chaotic streets.
Those streets were her classroom. The skill she developed, and the source material explicitly notes this, was to observe without intruding. She learned to absorb the nuances of poverty, of migration, the daily struggle of the city, all without making herself a disruptive presence. This capacity to be present, yet unobtrusive, that's the defining characteristic she carried into the migrant camps years later.
She learned to see the world, to really see it.
Long before she mastered the technical side of the camera, yeah.
And it connects right back to that empathy she developed. The humiliation, the sense of being an outsider, that became the lens through which she engaged the poor and desperate of the 1930s. She could approach them with a sort of equality, as she later put it, because she knew what it felt like to be vulnerable and exposed. All right, so let's move to the moment she decides to commit her life to this craft. She graduates from Wadley High School for Girls in New York City, and this is the amazing part. Despite having never owned or even operated a camera, she announces her ambition. She was going to be a photographer.
It just speaks to this incredible, focused determination. She recognized her own affinity for observation and decided the camera was the tool to channel it. And she immediately sought out training, both formal and informal, which shows you she understood that ambition requires mastery.
Tell us about that training. She didn't just pick up a camera and start shooting, right?
Oh, far from it. She studied under Clarence H. White at Columbia University, who was a key figure in early American art photography, and then she got these crucial informal apprenticeships. She spent time in the New York studios of really established figures like Arnold Gentha. She was determined to master the complicated, large format equipment, the chemical processes, all the things that defined photography back then.
And then this abrupt geographic pivot. In 1918, she and a friend decide they're going to travel the world.
Yeah.
But fate intervenes in a pretty chaotic way, and it pushes her toward California.
Yeah, they made it as far as San Francisco, and that's where the world trip was violently interrupted. She was robbed.
So with no money left, she's stuck.
She decided to settle there. It's one of those classic moments where a setback becomes your destiny. And she quickly found work as a finisher in a local photographic supply shop.
That detail is really important, I think. She wasn't just some random transplant. She immediately embedded herself in the local photography scene, in the infrastructure of it.
Exactly. Working at a supply shop meant she was meeting every commercial photographer, every serious amateur, everyone involved in the San Francisco art community. It was through that connection that she met an investor, and by 1919, she had successfully opened her own portrait studio.
So in just 1 year, she goes from being a robbed traveler to a successful San Francisco entrepreneur. And for the next decade and a half, her life was one of, comfort and professional success, photographing the city's most privileged residents.
She became the society photographer. She specialized in that fashionable, formal portraiture that San Francisco's elite demanded. In 1920, she married the noted Western painter Maynard Dixon, and her successful studio became the financial foundation for their family. It supported them and their 2 sons for 15 years. She was completely entrenched in the established, wealthy art world.
The contrast between that world and the one she was about to document is it's immense. She was photographing the 1% right when the bottom dropped out for the other 99.
And that pivot, it wasn't theoretical. It was forced on her by the raw reality of the Great Depression. By 1933, the economic catastrophe had reached a scale that you just couldn't ignore, not even from inside a comfortable studio. We're talking about 14 million Americans unemployed, countless people homeless. The social fabric was just tearing apart.
It reached a point where, for someone with Lange's sensibility, maintaining that comfortable status quo was, well, it was morally impossible. She physically turned her lens outward. From the gold-gilded drawing rooms to the breadlines in the street.
This was the true birth of the documentary pioneer. And this shift happened at the same time as 2 other massive compounding crises. The Dust Bowl, which was caused by both agricultural practices and persistent drought.
Right, all across the Midwest and Southwest.
And the subsequent mass migration that followed.
The scale of that human movement is so hard to grasp today. We're talking about 300,000 men, women, and children moving west to California. They weren't seeking a better life. They were seeking survival.
They traveled in whatever they could find. Dilapidated cars, trucks held together with prayer and wire. They were just wandering along the highways following the seasonal crops, only to find that the labor supply vastly outstripped the demand. And they were often pejoratively labeled Okies. It didn't matter if they were from Oklahoma or Texas or Arkansas. It immediately marked them as outsiders, as objects of scorn.
So Lange starts actively roaming the San Francisco byways, consciously abandoning her studio to portray this upheaval. She was using her camera not to flatter the wealthy, but to expose the luckless. And in doing that, as the sources note, she found her purpose and direction as a photographer.
This was radical in the early 1930s. This wasn't just photojournalism, quick shots for a newspaper. She was synthesizing art and social science and journalism. This period established her as one of the very first documentary photographers, a term used to describe using the photographic medium for a social, a political, a moral purpose beyond just aesthetics.
And her first image to really capture the media's attention in this new genre was White Angel Breadline from 1933. It's an iconic shot, but tell us why it was so powerful right at that moment.
It's a beautifully composed image of despair. It captures a lone man, his back to the viewer, leaning on a fence, his hat pulled down, facing away from the crowd waiting at the soup kitchen. The kitchen was run by this charitable widow known as the White Angel. The photograph captured not just the mass need of the crowd, but the profound individual isolation and quiet dignity of one man caught in that crisis.
And that image proved to be immediately catalytic. The sources note that its impact caught the attention of local media and, more importantly, federal authorities.
That's the key connection. That single photograph led directly to her employment with the Federal Resettlement Administration, the RA, which by 1937 had morphed into the Farm Security Administration, or FSA. Lange's work suddenly moved from a personal project to a government mandate. This was the moment her personal vision intersected with the largest social aid project in American history, the New Deal.
And this federal employment era is just inextricably linked to a profound personal and professional partnership. We have to discuss her relationship with Paul Schuster Taylor.
Absolutely. Lange divorced Maynard Dixon in October of 1935, and within 2 months, she married Paul Schuster Taylor. He was a highly regarded professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley. This was a partnership rooted in mutual intellectual and social purpose.
Their assignment was, well, it was brilliantly constructed. They spent the next 5 years traveling extensively, mostly across California and the Midwest, documenting the deep poverty affecting sharecroppers and migrant laborers. They were essentially a mobile two-person research unit.
And their division of labor was what made the work so potent. Taylor was the economist. He gathered the quantitative data, the statistics, the cold economic facts. Lange provided the visual evidence and the human context. While she took the photos, she also took meticulous notes. They were merging social science with visual art, and they lived and worked out of Berkeley for the rest of her life.
Let's talk more about her technique, because she took those observational skills she learned as a child and really formalized them into a professional methodology. It wasn't just about the visual composition. It was about the text that went with it.
That's right. Lange insisted on what we'd now call a high-touch, low-intrusion approach. She wouldn't just sneak a photo. She would talk with her subjects, often for a long time, specifically to put them at ease, to establish a rapport. This conversational effort was critical for her to achieve that sort of equality she was always seeking.
And what she collected wasn't just pleasantries. She meticulously documented their pertinent remarks. Explain why that distinction is so critical to the FSA's mission.
The FSA wasn't just collecting art. It was collecting evidence to justify massive government programs, relief, infrastructure, housing. The pertinent remarks were the personal captions, direct quotes, facts about the family situation, where they were from, where they were going, how many kids they had, what they needed.
So an image of a tired woman and her children wasn't just, portrait of a mother. It was, for instance, 32-year-old widow, 7 children, just sold the tires from the car to buy food. Nipomo, California, March 1936. The text provided the policy rationale.
Precisely. The words transform the picture from an aesthetic object into a piece of evidence, a detailed file demonstrating the urgency of a specific federal response. Her synthesis of visual aesthetics with this rigorous anecdotal data, it changed the game for social documentary work forever.
And this brings us to the photograph that has eclipsed all others. The image that became the visual shorthand for the Great Depression globally. Migrant Mother, published in 1936.
The subject was Florence Owens Thompson. Lange encountered her in a pea pickers camp near Nipomo, California. Lange later recalled driving past the camp, stopping, driving on for 20 miles, then being compelled to turn back, drawn as if by a magnet to the sight of this woman and her children.
And Thompson was only 32 years old, huddled in a lean-to tent with her children around her. That age detail often surprises people because the hardship and exhaustion etched on her face make her look so much older.
The context of their destitution is just. It's agonizingly immediate. Lange spoke briefly with Thompson, and she learned they had been stranded there because their car had broken down. They were surviving solely on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children killed.
Wow.
And in a desperate final attempt to sustain the family, Thompson had just sold the tires from their car to afford food. This was the level of crisis Lange walked into.
Let's discuss the production of the photograph itself. Lange took 5 exposures, right? And she worked closer each time, narrowing the focus.
She was instinctively moving from the wide shot, which captured the whole scene, to the extreme close-up that eliminates everything but the emotional core. The famous shot is that tight composition, focusing intensely on Thompson's face and the way her children's heads are buried into her shoulders. They're hiding their faces, which leaves her face as the focal point of the family's entire burden. And critically, she did this intuitively and very swiftly, without asking the subject's name at the time.
She later reflected on the interaction, and she noted that Thompson seemed to know that my pictures might help her, and so she helped me. There was a sort of equality about it. But let me push back on that idea of equality for a moment. If Lange didn't even ask the woman's name, isn't there an inherent power imbalance there?
Yeah.
Between the, well-fed government photographer and the subject who has just sold the tires off her car to eat?
That's the core critical tension that haunts the image, and really all documentary work. While Lange undoubtedly felt she was establishing an honest exchange of vulnerability for potential aid, she was still the one with the power. The power to frame, the power to publish, the power to control the narrative. The sources acknowledged this tension. But the impact of the photo wasn't contingent on that theoretical balance. It was contingent on immediate results.
And the results were stunningly immediate. Lange knew the gravity of what she'd captured. She drove straight to a San Francisco newspaper editor, showed them the photos, and reported the exact conditions of impending starvation at that Nupomo camp.
The editor published the images, informed federal authorities, and the government acting on this visual proof and the report of crisis-rushed aid, specifically food, to the camp to prevent mass starvation. Migrant Mother wasn't just powerful, it was the ultimate proof of concept for the FSA. A photograph that prompted immediate, life-saving policy intervention.
The legacy, of course, just exploded from there. It became, and it remains, perhaps the single most reproduced photograph in the world.
Oh, it immediately entered the cultural consciousness. It served as a clear visual inspiration for the tone and the characterizations in the 1940 film adaptation of John Steinbeck's novel The Grapes of Wrath. In fact, 22 of Lange's FSA photographs had already been included in the 1936 publication of Steinbeck's investigative series, The Harvest Gypsies. Lange and Steinbeck were defining the national mood at the exact same time.
But the power is complicated. While the image succeeded in its purpose rallying aid, defining the migrant experience, Thompson's son later spoke out. He acknowledged the image's power, but he also noted that Lange got a few details of the narrative slightly wrong.
And that's crucial for our deep dive. The family always stood by the photograph's central truth, that it powerfully projected the strength and the needs of migrant workers. But the personal, contextual details, they sometimes got a little distorted or generalized in the immediate aftermath of its mass reproduction. This foreshadows the later critical debates about the ethics of context and captioning, which we will come back to. Regardless, the historical effect was just undeniable. Lange proved that a camera could be a weapon for justice.
Okay, so now we transition to an assignment that offers a profound and frankly dark counterpoint to the success of Migrant Mother. Lange's next major government contract demonstrates that her photos were not just powerful enough to rush aid, but powerful enough to be censored, hidden, and locked away by the government itself.
The professional lead-up to this was extraordinary. In 1941, Lange became the first woman ever to be awarded the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship for Photography. This recognized her immense contributions to the medium. It was a massive personal achievement.
But shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, she immediately sacrificed that fellowship.
She gave it up to accept a commission from the War Relocation Authority, the WRA. Her mission was to document the forced evacuation and subsequent incarceration of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. This was a complete moral reversal from the FSA work.
Right. In the 1930s, she's documenting the dispossessed to encourage the government to help them.
Right.
In the 1940s, she's documenting the dispossessed as the government forced them out of their homes. That must have been an immense psychological and ethical strain.
It was a deeply sensitive and complex assignment. She traveled all across urban centers and agricultural regions of California, meticulously documenting families as they complied with these chilling government orders to abandon their homes, their businesses, their lives. She was tasked with documenting a legal travesty unfolding in real time.
Her images from this period, they shift in tone. They focus so intensely on the emotional and bureaucratic elements of the removal. They capture this quiet, stunned anxiety of innocent people facing displacement.
You see images that are purely bureaucratic, yet profoundly emotional. Piles of carefully labeled luggage waiting to be sorted for transport. Families wearing identification tags pinned to their coats, waiting for the buses or trains that would take them hundreds of miles away to these camps. Lange captured individuals who were described as being stunned, not comprehending why they must leave their homes or what their future could possibly hold. It's a photographic record of mass civil rights erasure sanctioned by the state.
The sources highlight one specific image that captures this cognitive dissonance perfectly. One of the American school children reciting the Pledge of Allegiance.
This is one of the most haunting images in the entire collection. It shows students, American citizens of Japanese descent, at the Weil Public School in San Francisco in April of 1942. They're standing rigidly, reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, promising loyalty.
And what makes it so chilling is the temporal context. They were reciting that pledge just weeks, maybe even days, before they were forcibly removed from that very school, from their homes, and shipped to desolate internment camps like Manzanar.
Manzanar, the first permanent camp, 300 miles from the coast.
Yeah.
The photo is a perfect indictment. It visually asks, how can you demand total allegiance from these children one moment and then the next classify them as dangerous enemies who require incarceration? Lange captured the deep moral hypocrisy embedded in the WRA's actions.
And this is exactly where the power of her images became a direct threat to the government's policy.
Yeah.
The visual evidence was simply too compelling. It was too damning.
Crucially, authorities impounded nearly all of Lange's photography of the internment process. They were essentially classified and hidden away. These photos were not seen publicly during the war because the authorities were, and this is the quote, sensitive to the implications of incarcerating tens of thousands of people who had not been charged with committing any crime.
So the government recognized that Lange's work, much like her FSA images, had the power to provoke a reaction. But this time the reaction would be public outrage and questioning of official policy.
Absolutely. The photographs were visual documentation of a massive unconstitutional injustice. By impounding them, the government prevented the public from witnessing the human cost of the WRA policy. It allowed them to maintain a sanitized narrative for the war effort. The dichotomy is just stunning. Migrant Mother led to immediate transparency and aid. The WRA photos led to immediate suppression and historical opacity.
The legacy of that censorship, however, was eventually overturned.
Thankfully, yes. Today, this body of work serves its intended powerful purpose. It stands as an undeniable reminder of the travesty. It's available for public access in the National Archives, the Bancroft Library at Berkeley, and the Oakland Museum of California. It is a restored record of historical accountability, demonstrating that the truth, even if it's suppressed, it eventually emerges.
Moving into the post-war era, the end of the conflict brought new professional paths for Lange, though her commitment to documentary rigor, that remained absolute. In 1945, she received a pretty important invitation from Ansel Adams.
Adams invited her to teach at the new Fine Art Photography Department at the California School of Fine Arts, which is now the San Francisco Art Institute. And she joined a foundational faculty that included giants of the medium like Imogen Cunningham and Minor White. This signaled her recognition not just as a documentary asset, but as a fine artist and a teacher of technical and aesthetic excellence.
And this commitment to shaping the future of the medium, it extended beyond the classroom. In the early 1950s, she became a key figure in creating what is arguably the most influential journal in serious photography.
In 1952, Lange co-founded Aperture magazine. And this wasn't a commercial venture. It was established to be a serious platform for discussing photography as an art form, as a historical document, and as a critical practice. Her involvement just underscores her belief that documentary photography was a vital intellectual discipline that deserved its own specialized forum.
She continued to take important commissions, including for Life magazine in the mid-1950s. But one of these projects dramatically highlighted the tension she always faced, the tension between her commitment to a subject and the commercial interests of these large media outlets.
That was the Death of a Valley series. Lange and a fellow photographer, Perkle Jones, were commissioned by Life to document the displacement of residents from Monticello, California. This was a deeply emotional story about a community being physically erased by progress, specifically the damming of Puda Creek to create Lake Berryessa. They documented the literal abandonment of homes, the history, the landscape.
They poured a considerable amount of time and emotional energy into this, capturing the details of families forced to leave their ancestral homes. But Life magazine, in the end, rejected the piece.
Life felt the subject matter was maybe too localized, too melancholic, or just too difficult for their mass readership. It was a clear clash between Lange's belief in the necessity of telling a story of social consequence and the magazine's commercial imperative for high circulation, broadly appealing content.
But this rejection didn't stop the story from being told.
Not at all. In a tremendous testament to her dedication to historical preservation, Lange then devoted an entire issue of Aperture to the Death of a Valley work. She used the very publication she helped found to circumvent the commercial pressures of the mainstream press. This ensured the story of those displaced residents was preserved and seen by the serious photography community. And the collection was eventually recognized and shown at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1960.
She also undertook another significant commission for Life in 1954 that showed her enduring interest in social justice, and this one stemmed from a very personal place.
This series focused on the defense of poor people in the American court system, specifically highlighting the work of an attorney, Martin Pulich, who dedicated his career to representing indigent clients. Sources suggest Lange's acute sensitivity to those marginalized by the legal system may have stemmed from a challenging personal experience related to her own brother's arrest and trial. She understood that helplessness you feel when you don't have resources to navigate the complex legal machinery.
So whether she was documenting migrants or incarcerated citizens or the legally impoverished, her focus remained intensely and consistently on the marginalized and the forgotten.
And throughout her final decade, her health began to decline significantly. The long-term effects of the polio, which had been with her since she was 7, they resurfaced.
She suffered from what was later recognized as post-polio syndrome, alongside other conditions that wore down her body. She died of esophageal cancer in San Francisco in 1965. She was 70. She left behind Paul Taylor and a host of descendants and, well, an unparalleled legacy.
Her recognition was swift and monumental after her death. Just 3 months later, the Museum of Modern Art in New York City mounted a major retrospective of her work. And this was monumental not just because of the speed, but because Lange had actually helped curate the exhibition before her passing.
And there is a critical distinction here that speaks volumes about her status. This exhibition was MoMA's first ever solo retrospective of a female photographer's work. It officially cemented her place in the history of art as a defining figure, regardless of gender.
Her enduring influence has continued to be recognized across institutions ever since. She was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 2003, the California Hall of Fame in 2008. And maybe most telling of her defining role in American history, Time magazine posthumously chose her for their 1940 Woman of the Year cover back in 2019, recognizing her profound visual contribution to that decade of crisis.
And the market, too, confirms her iconic status. The demand for her originals shows that her historical weight translates directly to artistic value. In May 2023, an oversized 1940s-era print of Migrant Mother sold at Sotheby's in New York for $609,000. It confirms its status as one of the most valuable images in documentary history.
But this financial value, this global recognition, it brings us back to that complex, critical debate, the ongoing discussion about the relationship between her powerful images and the words and context that go with them. The MoMA 2020 exhibition, Dorothea Lange, Words and Pictures, was structured specifically to force this conversation.
The central thesis of that exhibition, and the critique that follows, is that her images cry out for further information. They are so aesthetically powerful that they risk becoming divorced from the urgency of their original story.
Exactly. The critique argues that the aesthetic power of Lange's images is fundamentally bound up in their historical importance, and that importance has to be communicated through words and annotations. Without that context, they risk becoming generalized symbols of sadness rather than specific indictments of policy failure. And this brings us right back to her own rigorous method of collecting pertinent remarks. She knew the words were essential.
And this is where she faces criticism from both sides of the artistic and political spectrums, often unfairly. The art purists might fault her work for being too reliant on the textual context to function, while the political purists might fault the way her employers, like the FSA or the WRA, sometimes edited or altered or exploited the context for their own political ends.
Often against Lange's own original intentions. The critic Jackson R. noted this tension. He argued that the manipulation often happened after Lange completed her work by the government agencies that employed her. For instance, the Thompson family's later claims that some details were incorrect. That underscores how easily a government agency could prioritize a generalized, useful narrative over specific, complicated truth. Lange's work, Arndt suggested, was not context-proof like the work of some of her contemporaries. It required meticulous preservation of the story, a job often failed by her bureaucratic employers.
That's a profound realization. The very thing that made her work politically effective, the specificity of the captioning, was also the most vulnerable to distortion once it entered the public and governmental spheres.
But her place in history is nonetheless secure by the scope of her vision. Arndt was right to situate her alongside other cultural titans of the Depression-era writers like Pearl Buck and John Steinbeck, filmmakers like Frank Capra.
These were the artists who were collectively working to define the national we. In a period of immense fragmentation, fear, and economic collapse, they were forging a visual and literary identity for the American people, defining collective suffering and collective resilience.
And Lange provided the definitive visual vocabulary for that era. She took her own deeply personal experience of being an outsider, transformed by hardship, and she channeled that unique lens to document the societal hardship of an entire nation. Her legacy is the ultimate triumph of documentary truth over political inconvenience or aesthetic generalization.
Let's bring this all together. We traced Dorothea Lange's journey, starting with the formative traumas of polio and abandonment, which instilled that essential professional skill of observing without intruding. We saw her radical pivot from photographing the elite in San Francisco to embarking on a federally funded social justice mission.
We analyzed the stunning duality of her most effective work. Migrant Mother, which was instantly effective, rushing aid to prevent starvation, and the Japanese-American internment photos, which were so effective they had to be suppressed and locked away by the government for years to prevent public outrage and maintain policy.
She left a legacy not just of iconic images, but of a robust methodology. The meticulous combination of visual documentation with the recorded words of her subjects. And that continues to inform serious journalism and art today, despite the ongoing critical debate about how context can be distorted in the wake of mass visibility.
Her career forces us to consider the immense, tangible power of a single photograph to both heal and condemn, to reveal and to threaten. She understood that a picture, when it's armed with words and context, simply could not be ignored.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider as you wrap up this deep dive. Lange's experience showed us that photographs were powerful enough to be censored and hidden by a government controlling his wartime narrative. In our modern world, where every image is instantly visible to billions through digital sharing, the sheer volume of visibility is inescapable. So this is the question for you. Is the meaning of a powerful image today more vulnerable to distortion and manipulation by bad faith captioning and decontextualization? Or is it paradoxically more protected by the sheer volume and speed of visibility that prevents any single authority from successfully suppressing it?
Consider the tension inherent in that digital immediacy. Does ubiquity serve truth, or does it simply amplify noise? We hope this deep dive encourages you to look at those iconic images and the historical periods they represent with fresh, informed eyes, paying close attention to the words Lange insisted accompany the visual truth.